All right. Well, we'll get started here. Welcome everyone. Good to see you here in a bit of a crazy 2022. I hope you're all staying well or partially well or recovering from being unwell. So to help us kick off 2022 Water, Wetlands, and Watershed Seminar, we have Dave Tomaslo, and I'm actually going to hand it over to Miles Medina for the introduction. So Miles, if you could please introduce Dave.
Sure thing. All right. So David Tomaslo is currently the Executive Director of the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program, or SBEP. This is one of 28 national estuary programs across the US. Prior to joining the SBEP, David worked for a number of years as a scientist for various private consulting firms, working on various environmental restoration projects across the Gulf of Mexico, California, the Caribbean Basin, Japan, the Philippines, and the Middle East. Previously, he worked for the Southwest Florida Water Management District, where he eventually became the manager of the environmental section. David received his bachelor's in biology from Old Dominion University, his master's in biology from the Florida Institute of Technology with a specialization in marine biology, and a PhD in biology from the University of South Florida. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dave.
Thanks a lot. I should also mention Mark Clark and I worked together about 30 years ago for the Florida Keys Land and Sea Trust Museum of Natural History of the Florida Keys, which was so successful it doesn't exist anymore. So, but I think we both have our names in brass on the museum door, which is kind of cool. So, all right, let me see if I can do this correctly, and please let me know if this is not displaying correctly, but it should be the title page.
Oh, close, man. See, we jinxed it. So go to display settings and switch presenter view.
Oh, man. Okay. I got 3 screens going on, so. What? Yeah. All right. How's that?
Let's give it a second here to catch up in Zoom land. Did it switch for you, Dave?
It did for me.
And we're still paused here with the drop-down window is still dropped down. So we'll give Zoom a minute to catch up. Everybody else here on Zoom, you're seeing the drop-down and the presenter mode, right? Yep, okay.
All right, let me try that one more time.
Yeah.
You see, we jinxed it.
I know. So one thing sometimes I do is I will end the show and then I will drag it to the other screen and try to present from there, and also say a small non-denominational prayer.
All right, let's try it one more time. And let's see this one. That's not better?
So we see the sort of the main PowerPoint, but it's not in screen slideshow mode. So if you going down here, there we go. Yes, we are good to go. All right, you have the all clear, Dave.
All right, so I'm just gonna keep going with this. All right.
Yeah, so, go for it, man. Looks good.
This might be a presentation different than what you're going to be getting for the rest of your seminar series, in part because the audience of what we usually present to is different than you folks, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to get enough science to develop sufficient guidance on fixing the problems that we have in Sarasota Bay. So some of this might be a little bit less detailed than you'd want. If that's the case, contact me. We could have that level of detail and we just give it to you. But what I'm trying to do is give a presentation that's give you a presentation that's similar to what we use when we go out to the public to talk about how to manage Sarasota Bay. So let's get going. First off, a healthy bay is important to our quality of life. And we're one of 28 NEPs, like Miles said. We have a lot in common with every other national estuary program. We have the fish and the crab and the shrimp, the habitat value. We have features that provide, resilience to climate change. We have features that actually help to, provide blue carbon benefits. We have enough seagrass that we think we offset the carbon footprints of maybe 10,000 cars. We have some ability to maybe offset some of the impacts of ocean acidification. But as compared to, like, say, Narragansett Bay or Puget Sound, one of the things that people do to enjoy Sarasota Bay is they go out on the weekends, they throw their anchor out, and they stand around in waist deep water. And when they do, they want to look down and see their feet. That sounds a little bit weird, but one of the metrics of ecosystem health in Chesapeake Bay was this, he's now passed on, politician from the Maryland Eastern Shore who used to go out. They had a wade in, and he would wade out into his waist deep water, and he wanted to look down and see his feet because he did when he was a little kid. Well, when he was a little kid, he was also shorter, and he actually had better eyesight. But nonetheless, water clarity is our number one goal that we have for our system. I showed this slide to people, and some folks are horrified. Look at all the trampling, the impacts of the resources. And it's true. This is also a spot that actually, this is a shot from like Memorial Day weekend. But these are the people that are going to have to pay for the projects that have to be done for us to restore the bay. So there might be a smaller, to not small physical impact associated with this level of recreational use. But look at the background water quality. That's what we need to target. And we need these people's support. We need the public support to spend the money that's needed for us to restore this system. So Healthy Bay is also important to our economy. There's 20,000 jobs associated with bay-related activities in Sarasota. We have Cortez, which is one of the last, commercial fishing villages in Southwest Florida. And we also have, recreational fishing guides. I have two of them live on my street. We have the waiters and waitresses and bartenders and business owners associated with, bay-related activities. The left-hand side is Kadzan, part of the Ringling Museum. If you've never been there, it's gorgeous. And a lot of people come there because the view of, John Ringling's house looking over Sarasota Bay is beautiful. And it's really nice, but not when there's a red tide, not when there's a fish kill, not when the water's not beautiful and blue. But one of the other reasons that we really talk about the economy is there's a property value uplift associated with proximity to the bay. People pay more to live next to the bay than across the street versus a couple blocks away or a couple of miles away. And the totality of that property value uplift associated with proximity to the bay is worth $3 billion. And that's a big part of local government's ability to fund the fire and police and schools and the National Estuary Program. And so, people paying more to live on the water is going to happen as long as the water is a good place to want to be. And if you look at the dollar per square foot price of houses on Merritt Island, which is in the epicenter of some of the worst water quality in Indian River Lagoon, you can get a house a lot cheaper than in Anna Maria Island or Longboat Key or Siesta Key. And part of that is, frankly, because our water is beautiful, their water is not. And that really is actually something that we talk about as well. Also, some of the neat work that we've been involved with Miles and Christine Angelini is like, what role do we have in terms of making red tide worse? Because when there's a red tide, the property values of, sales during that red tide event are depressed about 20 to 30%. Up to a mile inland compared to coastal counties that aren't experiencing a red tide. That's some really neat work done by University of Rhode Island researchers. So a lot of people, no matter where you live in the watershed, have an awful lot to gain from a healthy bay. And the last part is, what I don't need to, stress to you guys, which is this has been a really crappy year for Florida's ecology. It's the worst year on record for Florida manatees. And when we talk about Florida's wildlife heritage, this resonates a lot. I live in Manatee County. And when we talk about water quality and seagrasses and manatees, we make sure people don't confuse it with marsh grass or sea oats. So this is a manatee that's actually feeding on manatee grass. And we talk about water clarity, and people get it. That one picture allows people to understand why water quality matters for manatees. The picture on the right-hand side is from Florida's East Coast. And when I first saw it, I didn't even know they were manatees, because the one in the back, you can see the rib bones. and they're missing that fat deposit behind their head. And the worst year on record for Florida manatees is due in large part because the extraordinary event that we've had in the Indian River Lagoon. And this is what we don't want to have happen. This is a photo, an aerial photo of the Indian River Lagoon, on the left-hand side, part of it, the worst part of it. But on the right-hand side is system-wide seagrass coverage. The green bars represent acreage, and we're down 60% in the last 10 years. The remaining 40% is so sparse that the overall food supply for manatees in the Indian River Lagoon is down 95%. They're starving to death. When they starve to death, one of the main reasons why they die is they drown, okay? And one of the other things that's happening is that blue line represents the distance offshore of the deep edge. They used to grow to, on average, about 700 feet. Now it's about 100 feet. So for them to find any grass at all, they're going to be in shallower waters where it's more easily for them to come into contact with a boat because the distance, it's going to be shallower waters. And also they're going to be more exposed to colder air temperatures. And because you can see video of, if you Google starving manatees in the River Lagoon, you'll see manatees kind of crawling out of the Indian River Lagoon, eating grass and trying to scrape algae off of rocks. That is not what we want to have happen in our system. So how do we keep that from happening? We use a lot of simplistic approaches to understand some of this stuff. And one of the things that we do is we talk about Sarasota Bay being sensitive to nitrogen. This graphic is derived from University of Maryland, researchers and communicators. And so on the far left-hand side, we have low nutrient loads, and we have, maybe even seagrass isn't there because it's a coral environment. So think like the exumas in the Bahamas or the dry tortugas. But on the far right-hand side, where nutrient loads just get excessive, you become the Indian River Lagoon. And we're not trying to be either one of those. We're trying to be right in the middle, optimal seagrass habitat, not for Sarasota Bay, but for each particular part of Sarasota Bay. And what we've noted with the work that we've been doing over the last couple of decades is that nutrients can adversely impact our habitat through a number of ways. Increased amount of epiphytic algae, increased amounts of macroalgae, elevated levels of phytoplankton. An important thing to note is that in the state of Florida, with EPA's concurrence, the only thing you need to measure to determine ecosystem health is the water column, is just what you dip out of a water bottle. And that misses a lot of other indicators. Now, no one prevents you from collecting this other information, but when Florida produces a report card of how well they're doing, they might miss a lot of the things that are happening if they're not also measuring the other things that we have on this particular screen. Excuse me. So we have a report card, and it's actually really important. We're going to spend a little bit of time on this. It's not regulatory. We're not a regulatory agency. We work by trying to build consensus that this is the problem and this is the solution, and hey, let's go forward this way. But we have lots of regulatory agencies in Florida, and just in my opinion, it's just not getting the job done. Regulatory oversight is a little bit lax, and we're going to talk about an example of it. We're going to talk about two examples of it. Most of our waters are already impaired for nutrients, bacteria. The regulatory approach is just not fixing the problem. We need to try something else. So what we're doing is we're coming up with a way to describe the health of the bay that is understandable by the public, because if you don't have public support, you won't go very far in finding a solution. And it's also meant to be actionable, because I love giving presentations. I love publishing. But my job now is to actually make something happen with our understanding of the system. So it's meant to be actionable. It's meant to not only say, oh, here's your grade, but what are you going to do about it? What is the next step? And that's what our management committee members have told us very straightforward. Tell us what this means. And we believe it's scientifically sound. I mean, we go through a peer review process, our technical advisory committee. Anybody who wants to join it, just give us a holler. I'll give you an email at the end and we'll get you on there. But our technical advisory committee includes folks from universities, Moat Marine Lab, local agencies, state agencies, federal agencies. So we've got their approval for what we're going to show you. Our management committee, so we have professional engineers and scientists who represent like Department of Environmental Protection and EPA. They've signed off on what we're going to talk about. But really the most important thing is our policy board. So these are elected and appointed officials. who've actually agreed with how we describe the health of the bay and what needs to happen. And in the state of Florida, policymakers are not just elected officials, they're also members of the Water Management District who are appointed. So we have members of the Water Management District, and we have representatives of Manatee County, Sarasota County, City of Bradenton, City of Sarasota, a town of Longboat Key, the major local governments in our area. And they've all kind of signed off on how we describe the health of the bay, which frankly isn't just a good news story. So our report card is really kind of important because we have a reference period. And we have a reference period because we want to have a target. We want to basically let people know what we're trying to get to. We don't know what Sarasota Bay was like 100 years ago. We just don't have any data that can support, that it was like this. In the Indian River Lagoon and in Tampa Bay, they use aerial photography from like the 40s and 50s to figure out the offshore distance of seagrass meadows so they can turn that into a depth limit. They can turn that into a water quality target. It works out really well. It doesn't work in Sarasota Bay because the deepest we can see on that historic aerial photography is about 6 feet. And we get seagrass meadows, for example, to grow down to like 12 feet or so. When we map seagrasses, there's control over how windy it is, the wave height, the clouds, the sun angle, the time of the year, the tide. But back in the 40s and 50s, it was just, a plane flew over and here's a picture of the water. They weren't flying to map seagrasses. They just, and so we didn't have ideal conditions. So what we have is a much more recent reference period. And it's a reference period that's recent, but we think it's an indicator of a healthier system. And we'll talk about that. During that time period, 2006 to 2012, we had a 28% increase in seagrass coverage. That doesn't happen if you're an unhealthy system. We've got good water quality data on nitrogen. Our nitrogen concentrations were lower. We have really good chlorophyll values, which is a measure of how green the water is, phytoplankton. And our targets are pretty good. And we never had a problem with exceeding our targets back in that earlier time period. And the data set that limits how far back we can go, because we have seagrass maps back to the 80s, we have water quality data back to the 70s and 80s, is macroalgae. We think it's a big part of the system's health, and we don't have good quantitative data until 2006. But what we see is 2006 to 2012, there was a lot less macroalgae than there has been more recently. So we've got multiple indicators of ecosystem health in terms of nutrient supply. So I'll give you a little bit of guidance on how we do our report card, because we want to make it simplistic, but not, overly simplistic. So we have for each bay segment, for each year, we calculate the annual geometric mean. So for Tomaslo Bay 2019, I know this is the nitrogen for this year for that bay segment. And I compare that to the average for the reference period. And for nitrogen chlorophyll, a big number is a bad thing. So if I'm below that reference period mean, that means that's pretty good. I have a lower nitrogen and chlorophyll than what was a pretty healthy system. And so we give you a 4. It's like bowling. The higher the score, the better you are. So a 4 is good. If I'm above it, but I'm within a standard deviation, you're expected to be above the standard deviation. You're expected to be above the average every once in a while. So I give you a 3. But if I'm above it and beyond a standard deviation with normal distribution data, with a bell-shaped curve, and not all our data is like that, we tell you right up front, you expect to exceed that maybe once out of every 6 years. 16% is on that tail end. So we give you a 2 if you're outside of that. And if your nitrogen and chlorophyll is worse than the worst year in that reference period, we give you a 1. Nothing more complicated than that. For seagrass, a big number is a good thing. So if you're above the mean, you get a 4. If you're below but within a standard deviation, you get a 3. If you're below and outside of standard deviation, you get a 2. And if you're worse than the worst year, you get a 1. And we map seagrass every 2 years, so there's a 1-year carryover on it. And for macroalgae, we use these categories that are actually been part of a reporting approach by Sarasota County, which is if you have a lot of macroalgae, we give you a 1. And if it's pretty rare, then we give you a 4. And so we don't weight these things. It's just an individual 1 through 4 for each thing, for each bay segment, for each year. And here's our bay segments for those who are maybe not familiar with it. Tomaslo Bay to the northeast, the open waters of Sarasota Bay, excuse me. And in the lower bay, we have 3 different segments with 3 different watersheds and flushing rates and things like that. Roberts Bay, Little Sarasota Bay, and Blackburn Bay, but we kind of group them together as the lower bay. So 5 segments each year, 4 different metrics. So what do we do with our scores? We color code this because we want people to just remember, the overall impression of the presentation, the results. And we do blue and red, and it's not political. It simply means blue is offshore Gulf of Mexico. Red is like, stop what you're doing. Something's going wrong. And so if you're 3.5 or higher, that means you have more 4s than anything else, which means, I'm as good as a reference period or better. That's a good place to be. And so keep monitoring it. Doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. If I'm 1.5 or lower, that means I've got more 1s than anything else. And that means I am now multiple indicators of worse than the worst year in the reference period. And that means I got a problem, and it's a potential for this to be, feeding on itself and the new normal, if you would. And so the greens and the yellows are kind of the transition between the two. But in general, if you're blue and green, that means that you're pretty similar to the conditions that existed when this was a healthier system. So here's the just kind of general picture that we want people to get. 2006 to 2012 was a good, healthy system across the bay. It wasn't one part of the bay that was driving everything to be good. It wasn't one part of the bay that gave us all the seagrass increase. We had a healthy system across all of our 5 segments. Tomaslo Bay continues to be a healthy system. Tomaslo Bay still stays in that blue range. And so Tomaslo Bay has got water quality that's as good as it was when it was as healthy as it was. It has no evidence of declining seagrass. And from our fisheries work, which we do fisheries monitoring, the catch per unit effort in Tomaslo Bay is greater than any other part of the bay. That's a little bit tricky because we have to change techniques. We do trawls in some areas and seines in other areas. But if you want to catch a lot of fish, Tomaslo Bay continues to be the healthy place to go. The upper part of the bay was doing pretty good until 2017, 2018. And what we think happened there, and I'm not going to go into in great detail, but what we think happened there is we had 3 things happen. The 2016 red tide, which landed into 2017. 2017, we had Hurricane Irma. It was a hurricane when it came over our area. We had very turbid water in a time of the year when the water is very warm. And in particular, the 2018 to 2019 red tide, which had cell densities of about 10 million or higher. And so it's a very bad red tide. We lost about 2,000 acres of seagrass because it was very dark, very warm. We think we lost habitat that might have supported an additional 30 million fish. It was such a bad year that we actually had an extraordinary effect on the fish populations that changed the behavior of sharks, which shifted their behavior towards preying on neonatal and young dolphins. So we had an extraordinary effect even on the dolphin population associated with the sharks moving their prey search, if you would, to include dolphins. Dolphins hate sharks, and one of the reasons why is what sharks do. But if you look at the lower bay, and then what you see as well is it shifts into the green because since that red tide, we've actually had really good water clarity. And our seagrass hasn't come back yet because there's really not a seed bank there. So we might need to do something to kickstart restoration. But if you come to that part of the bay right now, you're going to see 12, 14-foot visibility. You can be in 14 feet of water and see the bottom of the bay. So our water quality has bounced back because it's not an ongoing culture eutrophication phenomenon. But in the lower part of the bay, things got bad around 2013 or so. And we can't blame that on like the same phenomena that we had in the upper part of the bay. And it occurs across all those systems. But even within that lower bay, Roberts Bay is different than Little Sarasota Bay and Blackburn Bay because Roberts Bay shows some evidence of recovery that the other 2 systems don't. And we're going to spend some time on what happened in Roberts Bay to make it worse and what happened to make it better. And that's the kind of where we go in terms of management paradigms. So we use seagrass as a biological indicator of overall ecosystem health. We peaked in 2016 and we're down 22% from that peak. But we're still higher than we were in the early 2000s, and we still have more seagrass than we had in the 90s and 80s. And that's the thing about Sarasota Bay. We're not as healthy as we were 10, 15 years ago, but we're still healthier than we were 30 years ago. this is, and we'll show you some evidence of it. We are kind of ticked off because we had a great success story that slipped away from us a bit. And it slipped away from us a bit because we got too, I think, cocky about what we'd done. And we didn't pay enough attention to managing it as, more people moved into the watershed. But even within that, 22% decline, it's not as bad as the Inner Lagoon, but it's a third of the way as bad as what happened in Inner Lagoon. So this should make us nervous, and it does. But even there, the seagrass trends differ in different parts of the bay. The upper part of the bay, the big loss occurred between 2018 and 2020, consistent with, that dipping down, if you would, of the water clarity associated with 2 red tides and a hurricane. But it's still not dropped down to what we had in the 80s or 90s. So it looks like it's an episodic event, and it may be something we need to do more. But we lost seagrasses that we actually gained about 15 years earlier. And what we want to do is we want to get back to the conditions that we had when it was at its healthier system. But that's a very different phenomenon than the lower bay. The lower bay from 1988 to 2014, we had a 30% increase in seagrass coverage. It was a good success story. Between 2014 and 2018, we lost all of that success. So we're set back 20 years of progress. And that happened before the losses in the upper part of the bay. And while the upper part of the bay was losing seagrass, the lower part of the bay didn't. And part of that is because the lower part of the bay did not get as bad of a hit from the red tide as the upper bay did. The lower part of the bay has lower salinities. And so red tide needs a couple of things. And one of the things it needs is the salinity to be in the right range. And the lower bay being lower salinity, we don't get really bad red tides for the most part. The upper part of the bay, we do. So the lower bay, we think we have more of a cultural eutrophication phenomenon that starts off earlier. And we believe we've also kind of like acted upon it, and which is the next part of what we're going to talk about. So in that lower bay, excuse me, what do we need to act upon to bring about the recovery that we want to have? So we have nutrient loading models, but we also have a tremendous amount of data. We've got a data set in Sarasota Bay that ranks up there as well as, the impressive data sets in Tampa Bay. So we start with the water quality data. We start looking at any trends. And if we see a trend in the water quality, we start to now look in the watershed. Is there some similar trend in the watershed that can explain what's happening? And does that lead us to the types of actions that we need to do, or the types of things that we want to build upon? So let's look at our raw water quality data in Roberts Bay. And this is just how much data we've got. This is a data-rich system, and I'm not even taking it as far back as we could. But monthly data, average for Roberts Bay for each of the months over the last, say 30 years or so. And the individual data points, this is micrograms per liter. So a value of 200 is about 0.2 milligrams per liter nitrogen. You can see we actually had some higher nitrogen concentrations earlier, like around the early 2000s, higher than we have now. But one of the other things that's happened is we used to go below 200 fairly, not every year, but fairly often. We haven't been below 200 in about a decade. So if you look at the raw data, it's kind of hard to tell exactly what's going on. If I run a stat, I can say, oh, there's an up arrow, it's increasing. But that's true, but it's more complicated than that. So what we do is we take the raw data and we turn it into annual geometric means. And so the graphic on the right, the years that are in that green box represent the years that were in the yellow. So it's the last 7 years when we think we've had things go wrong. The horizontal red line represents, as you can see, the highest annual geometric value for the prior 15 years. And we can see of the 7 years in that green box, 5 of them have a higher nitrogen concentration than not the average of the prior 15, the worst year of the prior 15. So they would all get a score of 1 in our report card. So what we're seeing here is the reason why we shift to yellow is because we have more nitrogen in general in the last 7 years than the worst year of the prior 15. The red stars represent an exceedance of our chlorophyll criteria. We are impaired for phytoplankton because we have too much nitrogen compared to even the worst year of that prior period of time. But this is actually a little bit more complicated than simply saying that, because this isn't really a step change, and it's not really a system that continues to go up. So the last couple of years kind of show a decline. And we don't want to get too excited about it, why it went down, but we want to pay attention to it. So why did it go up? You can't blame it on urbanization, because why did it go down? We didn't take people out of the watershed. So we're going to pay particular attention to the overall increase, but also some evidence of maybe things got a little bit better. If they did get better, what's going on? So this graphic shows our water quality data at the farthest downstream site in the largest watershed at Sarasota Bay, which is Philippi Creek. Individual data points right here. And, you know, if we just do a simple like trend analysis, if it's linear, power equation, whatever, we could end up with something statistically significant. But what we do is we try linear, power, exponential, and then polynomial. And we go with the fit, we go with the equation that has the highest R square value. And that's the red line. And the red line kind of matches up what you see with your eye, which is the same kind of trend we saw in the open waters of the bay. The y-axis, the x-axis doesn't go as far back. That's why it looks a little bit different in terms of, you know, the years. But what you see is the nitrogen in the watershed going up and then coming down. And what we think this really represents is activities that occurred in that yellow box. So that yellow box represents 5 years of time during which we had overflows of treated wastewater from a wastewater treatment plant that was not at AWT levels. So it had a nitrogen concentration around 18 milligrams per liter. It had overflows that were inconsistent with its permit, inconsistent with the Grizzle-Fig Act, which is a state law, and inconsistent with our CCMP. Yet it occurred for 5 years. That's what I mean with don't expect regulatory oversight to stop your problems. It stopped because a local NGO took them to court, in federal court, for violating the Clean Water Act. And to their credit, Sarasota County found out, you know, that there was in fact a problem, and they've resolved to fix it. And they kind of have. We don't have those overflows anymore. And so the right-hand side of that box represents the end of those significant overflows. So during a 5-year period, 750 million gallons of water came out. And it didn't increase the nitrogen concentration to values of 10 or 15, but it took a baseline of around 6 or so, and it bounced it up to about 1. And so what we did see was it was enough of an increase that we think it explains the nitrogen increase that we see in the bay and the chlorophyll exceedance and the less seagrass. So we think what we have is a management action for a wastewater treatment plant that was miles away from the bay, but nonetheless had a problem. And that's what we kind of would talk about. I would normally end right there, but one of the things we want to talk about as well is Piney Point. And so Piney Point was, if you're not aware of it, probably the biggest environmental disaster we've had in about 50 years in our region. This is the University of South Florida's model. It's basically suggesting the movement of the water by putting tracers into the model. And this is in May. And I want to pay a particular attention to the areas that are kind of the light green. That represents 1,000-fold dilution. And 1,000-fold dilution sounds like, wow, how can you be worried about that? The nitrogen content of what was in Piney Point was more than 200 milligrams per liter of nitrogen. It was more than 10 times as concentrated as the worst performing wastewater treatment plant in our watershed. So if I take a gallon of Piney Point water and I mix it with 999 gallons of background, the resulting 1,000 gallons is 50% higher nitrogen concentration. So everything touched by that green represents the potential for a 50% increase in supply of nutrients, which is the reason why we think the response to this system was so large. So what did that do to Sarasota Bay? Well, first off, why would we think it would be a problem? Well, 200 tons of nitrogen in 10 days is equivalent to 80,000 bags of fertilizer added in 10 days. The lower Tampa Bay watershed load on a typical year is about 200 tons. So it was like getting a year's worth of nitrogen load from the watershed in 10 days. Tampa Bay's hold the line strategy for the entire bay was originally set at 17 tons per year. So in other words, to offset population growth, we need to find 17 tons a year to keep, hold the line, if you would. This was basically 10 years of population growth added in 10 days. And it was in a form that was in one of the most biologically available forms of nitrogen. This wasn't nitrogen that was complexed with carbon and organic compounds. It wasn't in the form of sticks and leaves and insect wings. It was liquid fertilizer. It was literally liquid fertilizer added in a massive amount in a short period of time at the end of the dry season. And that's the other thing. So what we found in Sarasota Bay, and Elise Morrison helped us out a lot on this, and big shout out to her, because we never paid her a dime. She just came down and helped us out with a lot of work. We had this stuff, this cyanobacteria bloom. People call it Lingbia. I think its official name is Dapis pleosa now, but it's a cyanobacteria, very well studied in Australia, where they've made the link between external anthropogenic nutrient loads. This is what the northern part of Sarasota Bay looked like for in May and parts of June. And this is not what Sarasota Bay normally looks like. That white marker there is the beginning of our transect. So we not only took water samples, we dove to the bottom of the bay to see what it was doing to our system. The picture on the right-hand side is a close-up of it. Common names for this are mermaid hair or fireweed. Fireweed because it causes contact dermatitis. When you swim through it, it feels like you're kind of rolling around in attic insulation or something. If a horse eats this, it can die. If a dog eats it, it can die. It's not good stuff at all. And it was all over our bay. And the thing about it is when you see it on the surface, that's kind of like near the tail end of its life cycle, because it actually forms on the bottom. And what it needs is clear water and a nutrient supply, because it's growing on the bottom. And if you see the little circles there, those are oxygen bubbles. There's so much photosynthesis that it lifts the mat up to the surface, and it gets transported wherever the wind is blowing up against the side. And this is what it looked like on the shoreline of Sarasota Bay. The picture on the left was taken by the mayor of Holmes Beach in Florida. And the picture on the right, I took it as one of the many marina sites. This had an absolute big impact on people's quality of life and on their economy. Waterfront restaurants, no one wanted to go there. When this stuff decomposes, it releases compounds putrescine and cadaverine. I think it's cadaverine. It smells like a rotting steak, and it's just awful smell. And one of the problems that we had is we didn't really know what Sarasota Bay and Tampa Bay were going to do in response to this massive nutrient load. So this is the same site 2 weeks later. And if you look at the picture on the right, you might go, oh, your nutrient problem, your algal bloom problem went away. But that would only be said by someone who doesn't know what Sarasota Bay is supposed to look like. That water is green. And the beginning of our wet season, we had phytoplankton levels at typically what we don't get until the end of the wet season. We started off the 2021 wet season with much worse water quality than what we typically started. And one of the things that we're trying to do, we have a manuscript that's in review for Marine Pollution Bulletin, is to kind of draw together that we don't really know exactly what happened, but a lot of weird things happened after Piney Point. We had a localized diatom bloom. A lot of people knew it. A lot of people thought that was the only thing that you could tie to Piney Point. We disagree. I've worked in Sarasota Bay for 30 years. I've never seen a cyanobacteria bloom as bad as what we had. I can't link it definitively to there, but if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, sounds like a duck, it's probably related to Piney Point. And then we had red tide. We always have red tide, but this was the worst red tide we've had in 50 years in the area east of the Sunshine Skyway. You have to go back to the 1970s, 1971, back before we did all the upgrades to our wastewater treatment plants. The worst red tide, it preceded Tropical Storm Elsa. Elsa pushed a lot of dead fish up against St. Pete. It did not create the red tide. It did not create the fish kills. It made them more visible, and it might have made the red tide a little bit worse. So the language that we use when we talk about red tide in Sarasota Bay is the following. Humans don't cause red tide, but working with Miles and hopefully this neat project with Christine and Miles together, we kind of view it as this. Humans don't cause red tide, but we can cause it to be worse. So why do that? This is a picture in July of red tide in Sarasota Bay, but look at the surrounding water. It's beautiful, it's blue. We kind of think that in this part of the bay, which is isolated from the impacts of Piney Point, it's too far south. When red tide got in there, it didn't explode the way it did in Tampa Bay because it wasn't primed with this excessive amount of nitrogen. So we tie red tide in terms of not that we're going to cause it, but why make it worse? So what we really need to do and what I'm going to end with, is putting our bay on a nutrient diet. We've done it before. We need to do it again. Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay are literally internationally famous success stories that are kind of slipping away a little bit. And I think what's happened is we had this dramatic reduction in nutrient loads, 60, 50% reduction in our systems, improving water quality, multiple reports and documentation, peer-reviewed literature about it, improvements in water quality in terms of decreased nitrogen, decreased chlorophyll, increased water clarity. And in response, our seagrass recovery has been dramatic in this part of Florida, not everywhere in Florida, but particularly in this part of Florida. St. Joe Sound, Clearwater Harbor, Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay, Lemon Bay, and Charlotte Harbor. The graphic here represents the percentage of seagrass as it existed in 1999. So if you're higher than 100, you have more seagrass than you had at the turn of the century. And so by 2016, every single one of them is higher than 100. Some of them, it's not much higher because you didn't have a lot of loss that you had to recover from. St. Joseph Sound doesn't have a big increase because there's not a lot wrong with St. Joseph Sound it has to recover from. Sarasota Bay, about 50% increase in seagrass coverage associated with a 50% nutrient load reduction. Look at Tampa Bay, the gray line, 70% increase in seagrass coverage. Overall, of those 6 systems, we've added 2 Manhattans, 40 square miles, not of seagrass, more seagrass during that time period, 1999 to 2016. So it's a great success story in that system. And we think we brought it about, not because we planted it, because we addressed the serious water quality problems that we had. So moving forward, getting near the end now, this is what we have to do again. And so we have our reference period, we have our water quality, we have our seagrass, we have a report card that says this is what we want to get back to. We have a pollutant loading model. It is not perfect at all. It has problems. Every model will have a problem, and this one has it as well. I could spend a lot of time talking about it, but we don't have the luxury of perfect knowledge, right? So what we're basically saying is it appears that the nitrogen loads in the last couple of years are about 20% higher than they were when this was a healthier system. We focused on dissolved inorganic nitrogen because we believe that is the most important form of nitrogen to go after. The nitrate loads, the organic nitrogen, the nitrate loads, the ammonia and nitrate. And that means groundwater becomes a very important part of what we need to do because groundwater acts as a filter that actually seeps out mostly inorganic nutrients. So things like septic tanks, over application of reclaimed water, all those things become more important than urban stormwater runoff because urban stormwater runoff doesn't have a lot of DI in. It is mostly a little bit more refractory than what we're going after. So could we reduce our inorganic nitrogen loads by 12 tons? And the answer is we think we can. Because if we look at the controllable nitrogen loads, reclaimed water, when you add nitrogen in excess of what IFAS and Abby Turner is a great source of information we use, in excess of what a lawn needs, then you create the condition for an excess being transported through groundwater to our systems. Reclaimed water will be less of a problem if we upgrade to AWT at more of our wastewater treatment plants. Spills, the spill problem that we had is a controllable problem. And in fact, we are seeing improvements in there. Septic tanks, they're not a big problem in terms of total nitrogen, but everything that comes through the groundwater is going to be inorganic nitrogen. So the totality of the controllable sources is much greater than 12 tons. So the reality is we can get back to what we used to have in that reference period. So then the next question is there a political will? Because it's easy to come up with a target. Can you turn that into action? And we think so. So we had a water quality workshop where we asked all our local governments to say, what have you spent on stormwater and wastewater? Not water quality monitoring, not habitat restoration, not paying us money. What have you spent on stormwater and wastewater over the last 10, 20 years? That number is $400 million. And that does not include the city of Sarasota going to AWT, city of Bradenton, city of Palmetto going to AWT, because that happened 30 years ago. So they have easily spent more than $500 million. And then because we've actually made them very straightforward, we've been very straightforward about the problems. What are you willing to commit to over the next 5 to 10 years? And that's about $1 billion, $960 million. About 300 million of that is operation and maintenance. In other words, you have to maintain these pump stations. You have to maintain your pipelines, otherwise you could have spills, catastrophic events. But that's not a new nutrient load reduction. That's just being cautious with not causing problems. But even if we take that out, $600 million devoted towards wastewater upgrades, stormwater retrofits for the next 5 to 10 years. 200 million of it will be spent in the next 3 years to upgrade that Bee Ridge plant, which was the problem plant, to AWT. Half of that actually coming from the Biden administration and the bipartisan infrastructure bill. The other half coming from Sarasota County residents. So there is a political will. This isn't a wish list. This is what they've publicly committed to. And so last 2 or 3 slides, I think. Is it realistic to be optimistic? Because what we're trying to do, this is nitrogen concentrations in the open waters of Sarasota Bay. And this is, 50 square miles. So our water quality now is the red bars, and we're trying to get it back to the blue bars. You can see that's a lot of work. There's an awful lot of load reduction to get us backwards in time to those lower nutrient concentrations. But remember, I said that we were not as good as we were 10, 15 years ago, but we're better than we were 20, 30 years ago. This is what we've already done. The reason why Sarasota Bay is the oldest national estuary program in the state of Florida is because it was in such bad shape that the locals asked for an NEP to be structured after the Chesapeake Bay program. And look what's happened. Our water quality is better than the 80s, but that's not the benchmark. We don't want to go back to the 80s. We want to go back to that 2006, 2012 time period. And when we talk to the public and elected officials, we don't oversimplify it, but we want people to know, this is your choice. What future do you want? Do you want a future like the right-hand side? This is Sarasota Bay right now. And the left-hand side is the Indian River Lagoon right now. Not every part of the Indian River Lagoon, but a lot of the Indian River Lagoon looks like that. So this is why, $600 million in new projects are worthwhile, because look at the difference in the outcome that you can bring about for your constituents if you do the right thing. And literally, it's not just us, not the implications. If we're going to have a Florida wildlife heritage that's worth having, we got to do more than what we're doing right now. And we, as unfortunate as it is in Indian River Lagoon right now, it's not going to be as simple as what we need to do, but we are using Indian River Lagoon as the scenario you don't want to become, because we don't want to be the next place where manatees start starving to death. And with that, I think I'm done.
Excellent. Thanks so much, everyone. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Dave, either real or, your little virtual emoji. And I'm glad my mom wasn't on this call. She lives on Merritt Island and probably would have taken IRL is a great contrast for you to make this really strong case. We have just about 3 or 4 minutes. We have a few questions from YouTube, but I think most of them actually you answered. So I'm going to go to the Zoom room for now. Everyone on YouTube, please go ahead and ask any additional questions. Christine, I'll open it to you first for your question about restoration.
Yeah, my question's also in the chat, Dave. I really appreciated that, and especially the political messaging at the end that this is in the best interest of sort of politicians for their constituents to make these types of investments. I think that was nice. But my question is about what are the role of, constructed wetlands and other sort of nature-based sort of nutrient mitigation features like upstream in the watershed, embedded in sort of urban and residential areas, in sort of contributing to these load reductions? Like, is there any place for them relative to the other bigger sort of infrastructure investments being made?
Yeah, so most of our watershed is urbanized, so we don't have an awful lot of opportunities, but we have a couple of high profile ones. So just this week, the Sarasota City Commission agreed to work with Bobby Jones, which is a city-owned golf course, and they're going to cut it from 45-hole golf course to 27. They're going to cut it basically in half, and they're going to use the rest of it as conservation easement for creating wetlands to treat the water that comes in from a big chunk of the upstream waters. So we do have a lot of areas where we're looking at treating our stormwater runoff through wetlands. We also have a big effort to enhance the nutrient removal rates of our wet detention ponds by doing plantings and just making them more effective. Wet detention pond is just like a ditch that's surrounded with chain link fence. I mean, what the hell? No one even wants it in their neighborhood. But if you look at a beautiful, well-designed wet detention pond with a nice littoral fringe, people like that. And so we're working with a couple of local governments, and we're working big time with, Lee Hayes Byron and Abby Turner and Angela Collins to do all sorts of stuff. We use IFAS folks all the time. They're on our TAC to come up with nature-based solutions for wetlands and even things like reefs. We put artificial reefs out to capture fish. We don't know if there's a water quality benefit, but we're actually working with Armando, I can't remember his last name, IFAS agent in Sarasota County, to try to find out if these artificial reefs that go underneath people's personal docks, does that have a habitat uplift? And is there a potential improvement to water quality associated with having more filter feeders underneath your dock?
Thanks. We're getting a lot of really good comments and thank yous from YouTube. Dave, I'll just do one more question from YouTube, which is from Adam Siders, wondering how the nitrogen is associated with the Piney Point discharge at all, knowing that it's a sort of phosphorus mining operation. How does the nitrogen make it into the water? Where does the nitrogen come from?
Yeah, so it's not just, it's a little bit misleading, called a phosphate gypsum stack. So the mining, the phosphorus is mined in Central Florida. They take the rock, they separate it from the clay and the water, and then they treat it with molten sulfuric acid. And so the end product is phosphoric acid and calcium sulfate. Calcium sulfate is gypsum. Phosphoric acid is the phosphorus fertilizer. Nobody wants to buy just phosphorus fertilizer. So what they do is they use what's called the Haber-Bosch process. They make nitrogen out of the atmosphere because dinitrogen gas is biologically unavailable. So they combine them together, and it's called diammonium phosphate, or DAP. The main thing that we sell is diammonium phosphate. That's where the nitrogen comes from. It's manufactured out of the atmosphere. One of the weird things is when you see those pictures of firefighting planes out in California and all that red stuff that they're dropping, that's also DAP. So one of the things that we've seen for years in California is after a fire, there's almost always an algal bloom in the receiving waters. It's in part due to two things. You've got a lot of erosion you don't have in the trees, but you're also adding fertilizer across that whole landscape. So DAP, if you go to a hardware store, you can find DAP. It is not only a fertilizer product, but it is also a fire retardant.
All right, Dave, thanks, Dave. And so for students who have to run to your next class, that's fine. It was great to see you. For anyone who'd like to stay on and ask a question, I know Dr. Clark has a burning question about TMDLs, as always. So you're welcome to go. Go ahead.
And if
Dave.
anyone wants to reach out for a question, we're really formal. Dave@sarasotobay.org. That's how you reach me.
Thanks, Dave. All right, Mark, go ahead and ask. And yes, students, if you have to roll, otherwise you're welcome to stay on.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, for an awesome talk. Always good to put it into a practical context, not just to provide the science of what's going on, but actually how does that integrate into hopefully doing something about it, which leads me to my question. It seems like you all have estimated some load reduction requirements to achieve the goals. How does that parallel with what the state has developed as a TMDL target for Sarasota Bay? And if they're not parallel, how closely are you trying to work? I'm not saying working, but trying to work with them on coming to a consensus so that everybody's kind of targeting the same sort of thing.
Yeah, there is a TMDL for Roberts Bay, but their model suggests like a 2% load reduction, which makes no sense to us whatsoever. We think that the problem with the TMDL program in the state of Florida is it's overly complex and overly sophisticated. They don't have the data to run the models they run, and particularly on the water quality side. When they're running bathtub or CE Qual 2, there's just, if you look at WASP, which is a typical water quality model that state of Florida loves to use, in the most simplistic approach, there's 17 different rate coefficients in WASP. And we have good data on one of them, maybe two. So it's just their water quality model, I think, is the problem. And we also believe that a lot of our, manifestation of problems is through macroalgae, which isn't even part of there. So we're really focusing on the nutrient loads. We don't have to have a water quality model. We just simply say, we used to have a lot of nitrogen, then we got rid of a lot of it, and then our population increased 70%, and we're back up to where we want to reduce it 20%. Now, what is going to be the exact response? The answer is, we don't really know. Mm-hmm. But if you look at Tampa Bay, right now, I think Tampa Bay is so successful that it's created a problem. People think that we can predict seagrasses and water clarity, excuse me, getting over bronchitis. But the reason why they did the big load reductions in Tampa Bay in the first part was because of macroalgae. Because it smelled bad on, the wealthy South Tampa, Interbay Peninsula neighborhoods. And that's not part of anyone's TMDL. The seagrass recovery in response to the water clarity increase, it wasn't part of their model paradigm. It just happened. So we think that they've gotten a little bit too cocky about their water quality response models. And so we're just not going that direction. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. We just think we're moving in the right direction.
But it makes your narrative that much more compelling, because if there isn't that regulatory stick to achieve these higher load reductions, then you're going to have to come at it through a more systematic appeal to those governments that are able to do something about it. So,
and they're the ones that it's up to them to make that decision anyway. The state of Florida is not going to require you to do something that you're not willing to do. That's just the way it is. Piney Point's been a disaster for 20 years. And it's not because people wanted it to be a problem. It's just it wasn't acted upon. And that wastewater treatment plant was overflowing for 5 years. So we've had more success working with our local governments than we've had, working with DEP. So DEP is a good partner, but we're not following their guidance. We're hoping they don't create a hurdle for us.
Yeah. Thanks again, Dave.
Hey, you're welcome, Mark.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yes, that's really sort of gratifying to think about the kind of approaches like Miles has been taking, the data-centered empirical approaches where the models fail and the data, like you showed, are out there. There are a lot of, there's a lot of information to draw from. So hopefully we can advance in that direction. All right. Thanks again, Dave. We really appreciate it. And we'll see everyone next week, same time. I'm going to go ahead and assume same place here on Zoom, but I will be in touch by email if there's any change to that. Everyone stay well, take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and see you all later.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, guys.